Johnny Carson was the biggest star in America. Movie stars, rock stars, I don't think anybody was bigger than Johnny because he was on night after night after night.
He was America's nightlight, charming, witty, effortlessly in control. For 30 years, Johnny Carson reigned supreme as the king of late-night television, holding court from behind his desk on The Tonight Show like a monarch in a tailored suit. To the public, Carson was the smiling face that tucked the nation into bed. But off-camera, behind the curtain and under the polish, lived a man who guarded his emotions like state secrets, and whose grudges ran deep. Johnny Carson didn't hate easily. He was famously private, reserved, and measured with his words. But when he did hate, he hated completely. And there was one man, one presence in his orbit, who earned more than just dislike. He earned Johnny Carson's absolute, unforgiving contempt. Not through scandal or one careless moment, but through years of tension, betrayal, and bruised ego. For decades, the public saw only the smiles, laugh tracks, handshakes, clever one-liners. But behind the scenes, it was war. A quiet, psychological battle that brewed across green rooms, studio corridors, and silent car rides home. Carson never went public with the full story. But those who worked with him, those who stood just outside the spotlight, knew the truth. And now, so will you. This isn't just about television history. It's about trust, about ego, about the one man who brought out the very worst in Johnny Carson and lived to regret it. For years, Johnny Carson played host to the biggest stars in the world, politicians, comedians, actors, musicians. Yet few were as warmly welcomed or frequently invited back as Joan Rivers. In the early 1970s, she wasn't just another comic guest. She was his discovery. Carson famously told her after her first appearance, "You're going to be a star," and in many ways, he made sure of it. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable. She was quick, biting, outrageous, and Carson loved it. He admired her timing, her edge, her unapologetic delivery. He not only gave her airtime, but he championed her rise, offering her one of the most visible platforms in late-night television. Behind the scenes, they shared a complex camaraderie, not quite friendship, but mutual respect layered with showbiz trust. So, when Joan Rivers announced in 1986 that she would be launching her own competing late-night talk show on Fox without telling Carson first, it wasn't just business. It was betrayal. Carson wasn't merely blindsided, he was humiliated. According to staffers and close friends, Johnny found out the same way the rest of the public did, through the trades. His protégé, the woman he'd elevated, was now positioned as his direct rival. And not a word of warning. That silence spoke louder than anything else. Johnny didn't scream, didn't rant. He simply severed the tie. When Rivers called to explain, Carson refused to take the call, and he never spoke to her again. Not at award shows, not in private, not even after she was fired months later from Fox. She was dead to him. That level of coldness stunned Hollywood. But for Johnny, it wasn't about competition. It was about loyalty. He felt that his generosity had been exploited, his trust discarded in exchange for a paycheck and a shot at his throne. Carson saw Joan Rivers' decision not just as a career move, but as a deeply personal act of disrespect. Others tried to defend her, noting the lack of opportunity for women in late night or how networks pushed for secrecy. But Carson didn't care. In his eyes, there was a line you don't cross. Joan crossed it, and he never forgave her. For the rest of his life, whenever Rivers' name was mentioned, Carson would reportedly wave it off with a blank stare or a dismissive gesture. It wasn't rage, it was erasure. This wasn't a feud, it was an execution. And to those who knew Johnny well, it revealed something darker beneath his composed exterior. A capacity for icy resentment that bordered on the legendary. While Rivers would later speak publicly about her heartbreak over Carson's silence, Johnny never responded. Not once. not even after her death. The man who made her famous would not give her a second chance, a second thought, or a single word. That silence became louder than any monologue he ever delivered. And it marked the beginning of Johnny Carson's most enduring grudge, the kind rooted not in rivalry, but in the deepest kind of personal wound, betrayal from someone you believed. In Johnny Carson had a refined sense of humor, clever, dry, and always tightly controlled. So when Andrew Dice Clay burst onto the comedy scene with a brash, vulgar, and unapologetically controversial persona, it was like oil meeting water. The two represented polar ends of the comedic spectrum: Carson, the elegant master of timing; Clay, the leather-jacketed shock jock of the 80s and 90s. And from the very beginning, Carson despised him. It wasn't just about taste. It was about what Dice Clay represented, a new era of comedy that Carson saw as crude, unearned, and aggressively attention-seeking. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly fought against having Clay appear on The Tonight Show, despite the network's pressure to stay current with the rising star's popularity. When Clay finally did appear, it was not during Carson's segment, but rather under guest host Arsenio Hall. That detail mattered. Johnny wanted no part in introducing this kind of act to his audience. The contempt wasn't just creative, it was personal. Carson saw Dice as a walking insult to the comedic craft he'd spent decades elevating. While other comedians told stories, Clay barked rhymes laced with misogyny and explicit jokes that had no punchline beyond shock. "It's not comedy," Carson allegedly remarked off-air. "It's just noise dressed as rebellion." Dice Clay, of course, basked in controversy, and probably couldn't have cared less about Carson's disapproval. But for Johnny, who viewed The Tonight Show as a curated space for clever, respectable humor, the very idea of Dice's popularity was an affront. According to former producers, Carson once threatened to walk off set if Clay was ever booked again, on a night he was hosting. And unlike many who softened with time, Carson's stance on Clay only hardened. Even as networks softened their grip on content standards and comedians pushed further into taboo territory, Johnny stood firm in his old-school values: discretion, subtlety, and wit. In his eyes, Clay had helped usher in a cultural decline of what made television and comedy worthwhile. If you're drawn to the hidden truths behind Hollywood legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Who else's private feuds should we uncover next? You won't believe some of the stories still untold. The tension between Carson and Clay may have never exploded publicly, but it simmered in private halls, booking rooms, and behind-the-scenes whispers. Producers learned quickly: if Dice Clay's name came up, Carson's mood darkened. To Johnny, comedy was sacred. And in that sanctum, there was no room for Andrew Dice Clay. It wasn't just dislike, it was rejection on a fundamental level. And Carson made sure that rejection echoed in every decision, every guest list, and every wall he put up around his carefully guarded kingdom of late-night television. In Johnny Carson's world, loyalty wasn't optional, it was sacred. So when someone from within his inner circle took advantage of that loyalty, it cut deeper than any public slight ever could. That's exactly what happened with Wayne Newton. At first, the two stars shared a professional respect. Newton, Mr. Las Vegas himself, was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, and Carson would often joke about his boyish charm and silky voice. But as Newton's fame grew and his ego along with it, the tone shifted. Carson began poking, harder, his jokes sharper, especially around Newton's appearance and rumored plastic surgeries. The humor, though veiled as good-natured, soon crossed a line. Newton, who prided himself on maintaining a polished image, didn't take it lightly, but the real fracture came when Newton discovered Carson had reportedly made disparaging remarks about him off-camera, comments that painted Newton as artificial, petty, and overly sensitive. It wasn't just a late-night jab anymore. It was a personal insult, broadcast to insiders across Hollywood. Newton was furious. He didn't just stew in silence, he confronted it. In a rare and explosive move, Wayne Newton marched into Carson's office at NBC and challenged him directly, allegedly threatening physical retaliation. "You say it again," Newton reportedly growled, "and I'll kick your ass." The confrontation was brief, but its echo rang through the corridors of showbiz gossip for years. Carson, never one to back down from a battle of wits, now faced someone who wasn't playing for laughs. The relationship never recovered. Carson stopped inviting Newton on the show, and Newton made it clear in interviews that the two men were no longer on speaking terms. It was one of the rare moments when Carson's carefully controlled persona cracked, and it revealed how deeply he could harbor animosity once he felt betrayed. What hurt most wasn't just the public fallout, it was the shift in trust. Carson had given Newton a platform. In return, Newton had stormed into his space, embarrassed him, and shattered the illusion of mutual respect. In the years that followed, both men moved on, at least publicly. But Johnny never forgot. According to those close to him, Newton became a cautionary tale, proof that even friends could turn when fame and pride collided. Carson's jokes about Newton stopped entirely, but not out of kindness, out of finality. The subject was closed. The door was shut. For Carson, who had tolerated critics, hecklers, and egotists for decades, it wasn't Newton's showmanship that crossed the line. It was his audacity to challenge the king in his own castle. And for that, Wayne Newton earned a rare position on Carson's short list of people he truly deeply despised. If there was one figure in late-night television who could shake Johnny Carson's famously calm exterior, it was David Letterman. To the public, their relationship appeared respectful. Carson had even passed him the torch in spirit when Letterman launched Late Night on NBC. But behind the curtain, the story was far more complicated. Carson saw himself as a carefully composed craftsman, witty, timeless, and polished. Letterman, by contrast, was brash, ironic, and subversive, often mocking the very structure of the talk show format that Carson had perfected. While Carson initially appreciated Letterman's offbeat style, that admiration turned sour when NBC passed over Letterman for The Tonight Show after Carson's retirement in 1992, awarding it instead to Jay Leno. Letterman's subsequent move to CBS and the launch of The Late Show placed him in direct competition with Carson's hand-picked successor, and more importantly, in direct contrast to the legacy Johnny had so carefully built. The rivalry was less about ratings and more about legacy. Carson believed in protecting the dignity of late-night television. He viewed Letterman's increasing cynicism and self-deprecating jabs not as innovation, but as an erosion of tradition. Despite Letterman's frequent tributes to Carson, his opening monologues, the desk inherited from The Tonight Show, and his refusal to ever utter Jay Leno's name on air, Johnny grew increasingly distant. Friends close to Carson claimed he felt boxed in by Letterman's shadow. The younger host had become a media darling, praised for his irreverence, his edge, his refusal to play by the rules. Meanwhile, Carson, once the undisputed king, was fading from view. What galled Johnny most wasn't the competition. It was the suggestion that Letterman was somehow better, that his sarcasm, detachment, and intellectual quirkiness were the new gold standard. Carson had built late night on class, rhythm, and silence used like a scalpel. Letterman built his on awkward pauses, sneers, and the celebration of discomfort. To Johnny, it felt like watching his life's work slowly dismantled in real time. And though he would never admit it publicly, those closest to him say the bitterness lingered. In one telling moment, when asked off camera how he felt about Letterman's show, Johnny reportedly said, "He's talented, sure, but there's a difference between breaking the rules and having no rules at all." Still, Carson never feuded openly. He made only a few rare appearances after his retirement, the most notable of which was a surprise cameo in a 1994 Late Show with David Letterman monologue. his last time on a late-night stage. It was a quiet, dignified bow. But even then, insiders whispered that Johnny's smile was for the audience, not for Dave. In the final tally, Carson's resentment of Letterman was more complex than his hatred of Joan Rivers or Wayne Newton. It wasn't about betrayal or confrontation. It was about the fear that everything he'd built was being redefined, without him. And that the new era, led by someone who refused to bow, was closing the book on the man who had written it.